Most dangerously out-of-control actresses who made the golden age look like a complete war zone. Forget the polished glamour. Old Hollywood wasn't all red carpets and halos. It was a toxic playground of unchecked vices. Behind those studio-managed smiles were women fueled by pills, liquor, and pure, unadulterated rage. They swung punches, crashed cars, and burned down lives, sometimes their own. These aren't your sanitized studio legends. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was the ultimate tragedy of the studio system, a ticking time bomb wrapped in ruby slippers. MGM forced her onto a brutal regimen of amphetamines to keep her working endless hours, and barbiturates to force her to sleep. By her 20s, she was a full-blown addict, completely uncontrollable. On set, she was a liability, frequently showing up drunk, passing out, or throwing violent tantrums when she couldn't hit her notes. Her behavior grew so erratic that studios began blacklisting her, unable to afford the insurance premiums to keep her on set. She married 5 times, dragging her husbands into her chaotic spiral of self-destruction. Garland would vanish for days on benders, max out credit cards, and engage in screaming matches that left hotel rooms destroyed. She once smashed a glass partition in a fit of rage, severely injuring herself. Despite the immense love from her fans, she couldn't escape her internal demons. Her tragic final years were a blur of canceled concerts, slurred speeches, and fatal overdoses. Garland wasn't just a victim of Hollywood. She became a dangerous, unpredictable force of nature that the industry ultimately couldn't contain or save, leaving behind a legacy marred equally by genius and absolute, terrifying chaos. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was christened the Sweater Girl, but she should have been called the Sledgehammer. Her personal life was a blood-soaked disaster that made her films look like children's cartoons. Turner was infamous for her volcanic temper, heavy drinking, and a penchant for picking the most violent men in Hollywood. She was completely out of control, engaging in screaming matches, trashing hotel suites, and dating mobster Johnny Stompanato. The relationship was a toxic cycle of brutal physical abuse and wild, scandalous public appearances. It all exploded in 1958, when Turner's teenage daughter Cheryl stabbed Stompanato to death in Turner's bedroom. While the courts ruled it justifiable homicide, rumors swirled that Lana herself wielded the knife, and the girl took the fall to protect her mother's career. Before the murder, Turner's on-set behavior was notoriously difficult. She'd refuse to work, demand insane script changes, and show up intoxicated. She once allegedly pulled a gun on a director. Turner's life was a high-octane thriller where the stakes were life and death, proving that her beauty was only matched by her absolutely lethal lack of self-control. She was a walking, breathing scandal that the studios couldn't bottle, no matter how hard they desperately tried. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was a primal force of nature who treated Hollywood like her personal hunting ground. Stunningly beautiful and notoriously foul-mouthed, she didn't just break the rules, she shattered them with a whiskey bottle. Gardner was a brawler who could drink any man under the table, including her husbands Mickey Rooney, Artie Shaw, and Frank Sinatra, whose career she actively ruined out of sheer spite during their divorce. She carried guns, flashed strangers, and had a volatile temper that terrified studio executives. When she moved to Spain, her behavior grew even more unhinged. She engaged in wild public affairs with bullfighters and matadors, once reportedly getting so drunk she rode a horse into a crowded hotel lobby. She was fiercely independent, violently rejecting the studio system's attempts to mold her. If a director pissed her off, she would walk off the set and disappear for weeks. Her heavy smoking and drinking turned her into an unpredictable recluse in her later years. But in her prime, Gardner was a dangerously out-of-control bombshell who left a trail of broken hearts, smashed glass, and exhausted leading men in her wake. She lived entirely on her own terms, unchecked and unbothered by the consequences. To know Ava was to risk total destruction, yet somehow the danger only made her utterly irresistible. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just a movie star, she was a one-woman natural disaster. Long before her iconic later years, she was a dangerously uncontrollable force, wrapped in violet eyes. Taylor's appetite for excess was legendary. She guzzled vodka, popped pills like candy, and had a temper that could peel paint off a trailer wall. She famously stole Eddie Fisher from his wife Debbie Reynolds, causing a national scandal that made her box office poison for a brief, chaotic moment. On set, she was a tyrant. If her trailer wasn't decorated exactly to her absurd specifications, or if the temperature was slightly off, she would refuse to come out. Her health crises were constant, often brought on by her own reckless behavior, leading to emergency tracheotomies and near-death overdoses. She wed 8 times, treating husbands like temporary accessories. She once violently threw a drink at Richard Burton during a drunken rage, smashing a glass across his face. Taylor's life was a high-stakes drama of addiction, volatile passion, and sheer, unapologetic diva behavior. She was dangerously out of control, yet her immense talent allowed her to get away with absolute murder in Tinseltown. She bent the entire film industry to her iron will, proving that while the studios owned her contract, absolutely nobody controlled the fiery, reckless soul of Elizabeth Taylor. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was the ultimate Hollywood sex symbol, but beneath the glamorous red hair was a woman spiraling wildly out of control, plagued by severe, undiagnosed bipolar disorder and an insatiable thirst for alcohol. Hayworth was a nightmare for studios to manage. She would disappear for days on epic benders, leaving multi-million-dollar productions completely paralyzed. Her marriages were volatile disasters, particularly to Orson Welles and Prince Ali Khan, marked by screaming matches, public humiliation, and physical altercations. On set, her drinking made her unreliable and aggressive. She famously stripped off her clothes during a fit of rage on the set of Miss Sadie Thompson, screaming at the crew. Directors recalled her staring blankly into space, completely disconnected from reality, only to snap into a violent rage over a minor inconvenience. The studio execs tried to cover up her drunken arrests and erratic behavior, bribing police and journalists. By the 1970s, her disease had completely ravaged her mind, but in her prime, Hayworth was a ticking time bomb. She was a dangerously unpredictable goddess who drank herself into oblivion, destroying her career and personal life one shattered martini glass at a time. Her tragic descent into madness was ignored by the very industry that profited off her beauty. Rita was a prisoner to her own mind, and nobody bothered to throw away the key. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's peekaboo blonde hair made her an icon, but her real-life persona was a dark, dangerous nightmare. She was a ferocious, unmanageable alcoholic who began drinking heavily in her teens and never stopped. Lake was notorious for her erratic, combative behavior on set. She would purposely arrive hours late, stumble over her lines, and hurl vicious insults at directors and co-stars. Her ego was as massive as her thirst for gin. When she didn't get her way, she became vindictive, once allegedly pulling a gun on a producer who criticized her performance. She was completely incapable of taking direction, often walking off sets entirely and leaving films abandoned. Her self-destructive streak extended to her personal life, where she engaged in violent, toxic relationships that frequently ended with the police at her door. As her career imploded, she became increasingly paranoid and unhinged, eventually wandering the streets as a homeless drunk. Lake wasn't just a difficult starlet. She was a dangerously unstable woman who wielded her fame like a weapon, ultimately using it to destroy every single opportunity handed to her in a spectacular blaze of alcoholic fury. The studio system created her image, but they couldn't tame the raging storm inside her. She was a cautionary tale wrapped in a glamorous, perfectly coiffed package of pure ruin. Susan Hayward. Susan Hayward built a career playing tough, resilient women, but off-screen, she was an absolute terror. She possessed a violent, explosive temper that she unleashed on anyone who crossed her. Hayward was a ferocious brawler who didn't back down from anyone, male or female. She was once arrested for drunkenly assaulting a police officer, biting him so hard she drew blood. On set, she was notoriously difficult, demanding total control and throwing violent tantrums if she felt slighted. She got into screaming matches with directors and famously physically attacked a makeup artist who touched her face without permission. Her heavy drinking fueled these outbursts, turning her into an unpredictable menace behind the scenes. She carried deep grudges and was known to use her considerable power in Hollywood to blacklist people who pissed her off. Hayward lived her life at a deafening volume, marrying twice and engaging in bitter, highly publicized custody battles that showcased her ruthless, take-no-prisoners attitude. She was a dangerously out-of-control powerhouse who channeled her internal rage into her Oscar-winning performances, leaving a trail of bruised egos, bitten cops, and shattered glasses in her formidable, terrifying wake. She was a force of sheer, unbridled aggression in an era that demanded women be submissive. Susan didn't just break the mold, she violently shattered it into pieces. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck was the queen of film noir, and she lived her life with the same cold, calculating ruthlessness as her on-screen characters. While she didn't rely on public drunkenness like her peers, her brand of being out of control was far more sinister and manipulative. Stanwyck was a control freak who ruled her sets with an iron fist, terrifying cast and crew into submission. She was famously cold, completely unapproachable, and possessed a volcanic temper that erupted when things didn't go exactly her way. She famously carried a gun and wasn't afraid to use it to intimidate people. When she discovered her husband, Robert Taylor, was having an affair, she didn't just cry. She allegedly threatened to ruin his career and his lover's life, orchestrating a campaign of terror that left Hollywood shaking. She adopted a circle of young, handsome men, treating them like pets and discarding them violently when they disobeyed. Stanwyck's dangerous lack of control manifested in her absolute, chilling need to dominate everyone around her. She was a psychological menace, a cold-blooded dictator of the studio lot who proved you didn't need a bottle to be terrifyingly, dangerously out of control. Her icy glare could freeze boiling water. And in Hollywood's cutthroat jungle, Barbara Stanwyck was always the most dangerous predator in the room, waiting to strike. Carole Lombard. Before her tragic, untimely death in a plane crash, Carole Lombard was Hollywood's ultimate wild child. She was a loud, aggressively profane, and fiercely independent woman who treated the strict moral codes of the 1930s like a joke. Lombard had a mouth like a sailor and loved to shock the stuffy studio executives with her outrageous, unfiltered behavior. She was a notorious practical joker whose pranks often crossed the line from funny to genuinely dangerous. She once threw a real, live snake into a rival actress's car, cackling as the woman screamed in terror. Lombard was a heavy drinker who loved to host wild, alcohol-fueled parties at her home, where games of strip poker and off-color jokes were the norm. She was an incredibly reckless driver who frequently sped through the streets of Los Angeles, completely ignoring traffic laws. Her marriage to Clark Gable was passionate, but fraught with explosive arguments that shook the walls of their home. Lombard was dangerously out of control because she refused to be tamed by anyone, living a life of unapologetic, reckless rebellion that blazed brightly until the very end. She was a whirlwind of chaotic energy who dared Hollywood to try and censor her. In a town built on fake smiles, Carole Lombard's dangerous authenticity was her ultimate revenge. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield was a caricature of excess, a living, breathing cartoon of out-of-control behavior. Desperate to surpass Marilyn Monroe, Mansfield engineered a life of unparalleled, dangerous absurdity. She was a publicity addict who would do literally anything to stay in the press, including staging completely fake, highly dangerous car crashes and walking down streets deliberately exposing herself to photographers. She was obsessed with the occult, surrounding herself with Satanists and weirdos and holding bizarre seances in her pink mansion. Her partying was legendary and incredibly hazardous. She drank to excess, popping pills while caring for her numerous children. On set, she was a disruptive nightmare, constantly showing up late, forgetting her lines, and throwing tantrums if she wasn't the absolute center of attention. She engaged in violent, jealous rages against her husband, Mickey Hargitay, once allegedly chasing him with a knife. Mansfield's entire existence was a high-wire act without a net. She was dangerously out of control, treating her own life and safety as a disposable publicity stunt, ultimately culminating in the horrific, fatal car crash that ended her brief, chaotic reign over Hollywood. Her tragic end was almost inevitable, given the reckless, frantic pace at which she lived. Jane didn't just push the envelope, she soaked it in gasoline and lit a match. Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters was a ballsy, brawling powerhouse who didn't take crap from anyone, but her inability to control her temper made her a genuine menace. Winters was a notorious hellraiser who loved to drink, fight, and screw her way through Hollywood. She was fiercely competitive and deeply insecure, a combination that frequently exploded into violent outbursts. She once got into a physical altercation with a prominent director, slapping him hard across the face in front of the entire crew for criticizing her acting. She was infamous for throwing heavy objects, including telephones and ashtrays, at people who annoyed her. Her love life was a chaotic mess of affairs with married men, including Burt Lancaster and Marlon Brando, which she bragged about loudly and publicly, causing endless scandal. Winters had absolutely no filter. She would show up to premieres drunk, insult powerful producers to their faces, and start fights in restaurants. She was a dangerously out-of-control firecracker who used her fists and her sharp tongue to battle her way through a sexist industry. Shelley Winters was a walking, talking riot, and Hollywood was absolutely terrified of her. She weaponized her anger, turning her rage into an art form. In an industry that tried to silence women, Shelley screamed louder, punched harder, and left a trail of bruises. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was the undisputed tyrant of old Hollywood, a woman whose razor-sharp tongue and volatile temper made her a dangerous liability on any set. Davis was a perfectionist with a god complex, and if she felt a co-star or director was incompetent, she would systematically destroy them. She engaged in legendary bitter feuds, most notably with Joan Crawford, but her out-of-control behavior extended far beyond one rivalry. She was notorious for arriving on set in a foul mood, chain-smoking, and hurling vicious, deeply personal insults at anyone within earshot. She once reportedly tried to physically assault a co-star who dared to upstage her. Her personal life was equally turbulent, marked by multiple disastrous marriages and a highly publicized custody battle where she lost due to her alleged erratic, overbearing behavior. At her lowest, she attempted suicide, showcasing a deeply disturbed, unstable mind beneath her tough exterior. Davis was dangerously out of control because she genuinely believed she was above everyone else. She was a cold, calculating dictator who ruled her films with absolute terror, proving that her eyes weren't just expressive, they were downright terrifying. She demanded total submission from her peers, crushing anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Bette Davis didn't just act like a queen, she ruled like a ruthless, unhinged tyrant. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford's out-of-control behavior wasn't just professional, it was deeply, terrifyingly domestic. While she projected an image of flawless elegance on screen, behind closed doors, she was a volatile, abusive monster. Crawford was a hardcore control freak whose moods swung from sickeningly sweet to violently psychotic in seconds. She was notorious for her ruthless, cutthroat ambition, sleeping her way to the top and brutally stepping on anyone in her path. But her most dangerous behavior was reserved for her adopted children. As detailed in her daughter's tell-all book, Crawford was an abusive alcoholic who flew into terrifying rages, beating her children with wire hangers and scrubbing them with harsh chemicals for minor infractions. On set, she was equally unhinged, demanding that crews address her as Mrs. Crawford, and throwing violent tantrums if a prop was out of place. She would drink heavily to cope with her own internal misery, leading to erratic, unpredictable behavior that alienated everyone around her. Crawford was a dangerously out-of-control perfectionist, whose desperate need for dominance manifested in cruel, sadistic ways. She was a monster hidden in plain sight. The glamour was a meticulously crafted lie designed to mask a deeply disturbed, violently abusive soul. Joan Crawford didn't just crave control, she demanded it through sheer, unadulterated terror. Mae West. Mae West was dangerously out of control long before Hollywood even knew what to do with her. She was a pioneer of sexual scandal, writing and starring in her own Broadway plays that were so explicitly obscene she was actually arrested and thrown in jail on corruption charges. West didn't just push the envelope of morality, she dynamited it. When she finally came to Hollywood, she brought her unapologetic, dangerous attitude with her. She was a complete control freak who wrote her own scripts, dictated her own costumes, and refused to bow to the newly formed Hays Code, sneaking sexual innuendos past the censors with a wicked grin. Behind the scenes, she was a ruthless businesswoman who hoarded money, underpaid her co-stars, and fired anyone who questioned her authority. She surrounded herself with muscular young men, treating them like disposable playthings. West was dangerous because she possessed an absolute, unshakable belief in her own power. She was an outlaw who hijacked the Hollywood machine, forcing the entire industry to cater to her bizarre, sex-fueled whims. She was uncontrollable, unapologetic, and utterly terrifying to the moral guardians of her era. She single-handedly threatened to bring down the entire studio censorship system with her sheer audacity. Mae West was a sexual revolutionary who held Hollywood hostage with a smirk. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson ruled the silent era as a majestic queen, but her reign was marked by a dangerous, dictatorial insanity. Swanson was utterly convinced of her own divine right to rule Hollywood, and her out-of-control ego made her impossible to work with. She was a notorious micromanager who demanded total control over every single aspect of her films, from the lighting to the wardrobe, driving directors to absolute nervous breakdowns. She was incredibly extravagant, wasting millions of dollars of studio money on absurd demands, like importing real French furniture for a single scene. Her personal life was a chaotic mess of bizarre health fads and toxic relationships. She married a man who turned out to be a fraud and a tyrant, leading to a disastrous, highly publicized divorce, where she lost most of her fortune. Even her famous comeback in Sunset Boulevard masked a deeply eccentric, controlling woman who lived in a fantasy world of her own making. Swanson was dangerously out of control because she completely lost touch with reality, treating the real world like a movie set where she was the permanent, unquestioned director of all human existence. Her delusions of grandeur were so immense that she couldn't separate her on-screen royalty from her off-screen reality. Gloria was a dangerous prisoner of her own spectacular, terrifying ego. Clara Bow. Clara Bow was the original It Girl, but her real life was a nightmare of unchecked trauma and dangerous behavior. Raised in extreme poverty by a violently abusive, mentally ill mother who once tried to stab her to death, Bow entered Hollywood completely unequipped to handle fame. She became a wildly out-of-control sex symbol, engaging in notorious, massive orgies with the USC football team and various Hollywood executives. Her dressing room was a revolving door of men, and she possessed an insatiable appetite for rough, dangerous sex that shocked even the jaded elites of 1920s Hollywood. She was a heavy drinker, who frequently got into violent, screaming catfights with other actresses over men. The studio tried to cover up her erratic behavior, her alleged abortions, and her vicious temper, but the pressure broke her. She began having full-blown mental breakdowns on set, throwing furniture and weeping hysterically. Bow's dangerous lack of control was a direct result of her horrific upbringing, manifesting as a self-destructive explosion of sex, alcohol, and violence. She burned brightly, flamed out spectacularly, and left a scandalous legacy that terrified the studio bosses. She was a raw, bleeding wound of a human being who used sex and chaos as anesthesia. Clara was the ultimate casualty of Hollywood's insatiable, destructive appetite. Louise Brooks. Louise Brooks was a stunningly beautiful flapper icon who possessed a dark, self-destructive streak that ultimately annihilated her career. She was fiercely intelligent but dangerously arrogant, completely lacking the filter or humility required to survive the brutal studio system. Brooks was notoriously out of control when it came to authority. If a director told her to do something she didn't want to do, she simply wouldn't do it, often laughing in their faces. She was a heavy drinker who loved to party, frequently showing up to sets hungover or completely intoxicated. She engaged in wild, promiscuous affairs with both men and women, caring little for the moral clauses in her studio contracts. Her most dangerous trait was her absolute, burning desire to sabotage herself. She deliberately alienated powerful producers, walked out on lucrative contracts, and burned every single bridge she crossed. Brooks didn't just fail upwards. She spectacularly engineered her own downfall out of sheer spite and rebellion. She was a dangerously uncontrollable rebel who chose to be a forgotten, impoverished washout rather than play by Hollywood's corrupt, suffocating rules. Her defiance was legendary, but it was also profoundly suicidal. Louise Brooks was a gorgeous, brilliant disaster who aggressively threw away her crown just to spite the king. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow, known as the blonde bombshell, lived a short life packed with dangerously out-of-control moments. Long before her tragic death at 26, Harlow was a chaotic force of nature. She was a rebellious teenager who married at 16 to escape her controlling mother, quickly diving into the wild Hollywood party scene. Harlow was infamous for her reckless behavior, once taking a naked swim at a crowded Hollywood party just for the shock value. She had a violent, explosive temper that she unleashed on set when frustrated, throwing heavy script binders and screaming profanities at directors. Her love life was a disastrous string of toxic relationships, most notably with producer Paul Byrne, whose shocking, bloody suicide in their home sent Harlow into a tailspin of heavy drinking and erratic behavior. She was also involved in a horrific, highly publicized car crash that left her scarred and in severe pain, leading to an increased reliance on alcohol and pills to cope. Harlow was a dangerously chaotic mixture of childlike vulnerability and explosive rebellion, leaving a trail of scandal, wreckage, and tragedy in her brief, blazing path through Hollywood. She was a ticking time bomb of raw, unbridled energy in an industry that demanded perfect compliance. Jean's tragic end was almost foreshadowed by the frantic, dangerous pace of her life. Jean Tierney. Jean Tierney's beauty was legendary, but her mind was a dangerously unstable battlefield. She was a diagnosed schizophrenic, whose out-of-control behavior shocked Hollywood's elite. Tierney's descent into madness was terrifying and deeply tragic. While pregnant, she contracted rubella from a fan, which led to her daughter being born severely mentally disabled. The guilt shattered Tierney's psyche, triggering violent, unpredictable mood swings and deep depressions. She became completely unmanageable on set, suffering from hysterical fits of rage and profound paranoia. She would lock herself in her dressing room, screaming at invisible demons, and once physically attacked a makeup artist she believed was trying to poison her. Her treatment was equally horrifying. She was subjected to brutal, unregulated insulin shock therapy that nearly killed her, and her family briefly considered a lobotomy to silence her outbursts. Tierney was dangerous because she lost all grip on reality, turning from a refined, elegant actress into a violently unpredictable patient. She threw herself out of moving cars and attempted suicide multiple times. Her struggle with mental illness made her a dangerously out-of-control figure, in an era that had no idea how to handle severe psychological breakdowns. She was a prisoner of her own fragmented mind, trapped in a nightmare that the glitz and glamour of Hollywood couldn't hide or cure. Jean was a heartbreaking tragedy. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer was Hollywood's ultimate tragic rebel, a fiercely independent woman whose out-of-control rage brought down the full, brutal force of the establishment. Farmer was a brilliant but deeply volatile actress who absolutely despised the phoniness of Hollywood. She was a notorious drunk who got into violent, screaming altercations with studio executives, directors, and anyone who tried to control her. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic and dangerous. She was arrested for drunk driving, and during her booking, she allegedly assaulted police officers, screaming obscenities and physically resisting arrest. This led to her being institutionalized, where her out-of-control legend truly began. She was subjected to horrific abuses in mental hospitals, including electroshock therapy and alleged sexual assaults. Instead of breaking her, the torture made her even more violent and defiant. She once reportedly attacked an orderly and had to be physically restrained. Farmer's dangerous lack of control was a direct response to a suffocating, patriarchal system trying to crush her spirit. She was a fiercely untamed woman who fought back with everything she had, turning her mental breakdowns into acts of violent, tragic rebellion against the world. Her story remains one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history, a terrifying testament to what happens when a wild, brilliant soul collides with a cruel, unforgiving machine. Diana Dors. Diana Dors was Britain's answer to Marilyn Monroe, but she was significantly more dangerous, cynical, and out of control. Dors was a hardcore party girl who treated post-war London like her personal decadent playground. She was a heavy drinker, a notorious gambler, and a sexual libertine who engaged in wild, scandalous affairs that shocked the conservative British public. Her out-of-control behavior wasn't just tabloid fodder, it was genuinely criminal. She was investigated by Scotland Yard for her connections to a massive gambling ring and faced threats of imprisonment. She hosted infamous, hedonistic sex parties at her mansion, where she surrounded herself with gangsters, aristocrats, and criminals. On set, she was a nightmare, showing up drunk, refusing to memorize her lines, and demanding outrageous sums of money just to show up. She once pulled a knife on a producer during a contract dispute. Dors was dangerously out of control because she actively courted the criminal underworld and thrived on pure chaos. She was a fearless, reckless bombshell who lived entirely on the edge, laughing as she danced dangerously close to the abyss of total ruin. She was a glorious, chaotic mess who refused to apologize for her appetites. Diana Dors didn't just walk on the wild side. She owned the deed to it. Anne Sheridan. Anne Sheridan was labeled the oomph girl by the studios, but she was really the knockout girl in every sense of the word. Sheridan had a dangerously explosive temper and zero tolerance for Hollywood BS. She was a notorious brawler who didn't hesitate to use her fists when she felt disrespected. She once physically punched a studio executive in the face for making a lewd comment, nearly getting herself blacklisted. She was a heavy drinker who loved to hang out with the boys, matching them drink for drink and curse word for curse word, shocking the conservative moral police of the era. Sheridan was completely out of control when it came to her contracts. She violently rebelled against Warner Brothers, refusing roles, walking off sets, and engaging in screaming matches with Jack Warner himself. She married multiple times, with her relationships frequently ending in drunken, furniture-smashing blowouts. Sheridan was a dangerously rebellious force who refused to be packaged as a passive sex symbol. She was a tough, volatile broad who punched, drank, and fought her way through Hollywood, leaving a trail of bruised egos and broken furniture. She was a fierce, unyielding force of nature who terrorized the very men who tried to exploit her. Anne Sheridan was a beautiful, violent hurricane that Hollywood couldn't contain. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was celebrated as the most beautiful woman in the world, but beneath that stunning exterior was a dangerously erratic, out-of-control personality. Lamarr was fiercely intelligent, but deeply bored and impulsive, leading to a life of shocking rebellions. She was a notorious shoplifter who was arrested multiple times for stealing expensive items from high-end department stores, not out of necessity, but for the sheer, dangerous thrill of it. Her marriages were a chaotic disaster. She married 6 times, frequently to abusive, domineering men whom she would eventually flee from in the middle of the night. She adopted a child in secret, hiding the baby from her husband, causing a massive scandal. On set, her behavior was incredibly unpredictable. She would refuse to act if the lighting wasn't perfect, walk off in a huff, and engage in bitter, vindictive feuds with directors. As she aged, her out-of-control impulses worsened, culminating in severe plastic surgery addictions and bizarre, reclusive behavior. Lamarr was a dangerously unstable genius, whose stunning beauty masked a deeply restless, impulsive mind that constantly sabotaged her own happiness and success. She was a brilliant, bored rebel who treated the world as her personal playground, breaking rules and laws just to feel something. Hedy was a beautiful, dangerous enigma. Jane Russell. Jane Russell was marketed as a pure sex symbol, but behind the scenes, she was a wildly out-of-control, foul-mouthed rebel with an explosive temper. Russell absolutely hated the hypocritical morality of the studio system and actively rebelled against it. She was a heavy drinker and a notorious hellraiser who loved to shock her co-stars with her incredibly dirty jokes and aggressive behavior. She was a fiercely independent woman who got into screaming, violent arguments with Howard Hughes, the powerful billionaire who essentially owned her contract. She once famously threw a heavy typewriter at a wall during a dispute with him, narrowly missing his head. Russell was dangerously out of control because she refused to be silenced or controlled. She engaged in wild, scandalous affairs, spoke her mind with a brutal, unfiltered honesty that terrorized press agents, and actively fought against the studio's attempts to censor her. Her temper was legendary. If a reporter asked a stupid question, she would verbally eviscerate them in front of a crowd. Russell was a dangerous, ballsy powerhouse who used her sexuality and her fists to bash her way through Hollywood's suffocating walls. She was a walking contradiction, a conservative Christian who cursed like a sailor and threw typewriters like a pitcher. Jane was a dangerously unpredictable force of pure, unapologetic nature. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe's out-of-control behavior is the stuff of dark Hollywood legend, far removed from her bubbly blonde persona. Monroe was a deeply disturbed woman trapped in a nightmare of addiction and mental illness. She was heavily reliant on barbiturates, amphetamines, and alcohol, frequently mixing them in dangerous cocktails that left her completely incapacitated. On set, she was a massive liability, routinely showing up hours late, if she showed up at all, and forgetting her lines to the point where directors had to write them on hidden blackboards. She engaged in highly volatile, scandalous affairs, most notoriously with President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert, putting national security at risk. Her mood swings were violent and terrifying. She would throw tantrums, smash mirrors, and lock herself in rooms for days. Her marriages to Arthur Miller and Joe DiMaggio were marked by explosive arguments and alleged physical altercations. Monroe was dangerously out of control because her self-destruction was absolute and public. She was a ticking time bomb of vulnerability and excess, and the industry's exploitation of her fragile psyche ultimately led to her tragic, fatal overdose at just 36. She was a beautifully broken doll that the world mercilessly played with until she shattered. Marilyn's dangerous chaos wasn't an act. It was a heartbreaking cry for help that went entirely unanswered. The golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was forged in fire, blood, and scandal. These 25 women didn't just survive the studio machine. They violently rebelled against it, leaving a trail of shattered glass, broken hearts, and legendary chaos in their wake. They were dangerous, untamed, and absolutely unforgettable. Which of these Hollywood rebels shocks you the most? Tell us in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more unfiltered history.